Good morning, everybody. And greetings from the land of make-believe, Washington, D.C., where we came from a few days ago, and out here in the Midwest for a couple of days talking about some very important ideas going on out there. And I joke with my co-author, Arthur Laffer, who is fantastic. He's a big fan of the Show Me Institute, and he says many, many good things about the work that you're doing. And he jokes with me that we almost need to rename this project Poor States, Poorer States instead of Rich States, Poor States because of exactly how bad things have been across the states. I mean, no state has really escaped this economic downturn unscathed, although some have certainly performed better than others. And I want to talk a little bit about that case study analysis today. For those of you not familiar with ALEC, we're the American Legislative Exchange Council. We're the largest nonpartisan membership organization of state legislators, where state legislators actually will pay dues to become members of our organization. We have 2,100 currently elected state legislators from the 50 states that are members of ALEC, and we work with the private sector to bring about Jeffersonian policy, very much aligned with the vision of the Show Me Institute here in Missouri at a national scale with legislators. Today, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly so we save some time for questions and we can get Dr. Haslag's presentation. I'm very much interested in hearing what he has to say as well. But I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, the spending side, because as we're looking at fiscal policy across the 50 states, is it impossible to analyze tax policy in a holistic sense without also talking about the spending side? Because at the state level, we don't have the luxury of printing money like we do in Washington, D.C., and believe it or not, 48 of the 50 states have balanced budget requirements of some varying degree over another. So there really is this necessity to really keep a close eye on spending. And if you overspend at the state level, it's basically you're basically setting yourself up for future tax increases. Now, I mentioned the states have all been in red ink since 2008 generally. I think it begs the question is what caused the big problem at the state level on finances. I think it's very clear. The Mercatus Center at George Mason University did a study that showed that state spending over the last decade alone has grown 90% faster than the private sector over the last decade. It's unbelievable that that could happen through the business cycle like we've seen over a full decade's worth of data, that the state government alone has grown 90% faster than the private sector. That has really set states up to fail. And talking more about the need for priority-based budgeting is a key across the states today to say, maybe we ought to think about things as needs versus wants. Maybe we ought to focus on the core functions of government and maybe let the private sector do many of the other responsibilities in an effort to get the budget situation under control and make your state more competitive on the tax side of things. The biggest threat to state finances today, though, I think, is the unfunded liabilities in public pension systems. These threaten to cripple the states for the next years ahead, and they basically make state budget shortfalls look like very trivial when you look at it. There's a couple of reasons. The saying is that when other government says there's a problem, the reality is always much worse. And government has now begun to acknowledge that there is a pension funding problem because we've overpromised for years and underfunded. It's very easy to kick the can down the road and promise future benefits with dollars you don't have to spend initially. That's really set states up to fail. And based on some private sector accounting models that we've followed, we think that the unfunded liability across the 50 states on state pension funds alone is about $3 trillion, which in Washington's a rounding error. At the state level, it's real money. That's a huge problem. The problem is worse than that, though, because many states today are still assuming a rate of return on their pension funds of 7, 7.5, 8, or even 8.75% for the next 30 years. They think they're going to earn 8.5 or 8.75 every year. Now, anybody here earn 8.5 in their 401ks over the last decade? Maybe Rex did, but I don't know if anybody else did, and I certainly didn't. If you did, I'd like to get advice from you because at state government level, it's almost impossible. And to reiterate a little lesson from 6th grade math class probably, is that when you lose 30% of a value and you gain 30% back, how many people here know you're not where you started in terms of value? So this is a problem. A lot of folks say that we're going to grow our way out of the pension funding problems. It just doesn't happen. If you go through the exercise, of course, here you can see the numbers, but I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly because I know we're running a little bit short on time. Talking about principles of taxation. These are the principles we have identified to create a pro-growth tax system in the states. Simplicity, that's straightforward. Transparency, people ought to be able to tell how much they're being taxed and who's taxing them. Neutrality, of course, this is something that gets very interesting in many states because we deal with the issue of governments wanting to always be able to pick winners and losers based on tax policy. We think it's a huge failure because government committees have never proven adept whatsoever at picking winners and losers better than the marketplace. Do I need to highlight things like Solandra? I don't think we need to go down that road. We don't have that much time. Predictability is key, obviously, because if businesses are going to make an investment in a state for $1 million or $1 billion even, they want to know the rules of the game aren't going to change after they've made that investment. And then I think those first four principles are necessary but not sufficient conditions, because the most important principle when talking about tax policy is the competitiveness principle or the pro-growth principle, is that state legislators, especially among our 50 laboratories of democracy, do not make policy changes in a vacuum. Every time you change a policy, for better or for worse, it's going to immediately impact your standing vis-a-vis surrounding states and states all across the country. Now, the concept of supply-side economics, or the Laffer curve, is very simple. It's been ridiculed over the years as being voodoo economics and been called many other things. But at the very basic principle, it shows how people respond to incentives and how tax policy changes people's behavior. So at a 0% tax rate, how much do you raise for the government? 0. At a 100% tax rate, how much do you raise for the government?
0.
Very good. We have a very smart audience today. And unfortunately, state governments do not get that, and neither do we do in federal government. We think that when you raise taxes, you get more revenue automatically, and if you just use a static scoring method, that's what will show up in official government statistics. The issue of tax flight and people voting with their feet is very interesting. There's a left-wing group, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities in D.C. I believe they have an affiliate here called the Missouri Budget Project or something like that, that is always arguing the nihilist position on taxes, that they don't matter. They actually said recently that weather matters more than taxes does, and that's why people go from one state to another. And I really thought this was supposed to be a satirical column that they were writing, but it wasn't, unfortunately. So you look at it, two of the places you never want to leave. Hawaii has lost population 6 out of the last 10 years. California has lost 1.5 million Americans over the last decade. I don't think the beaches have deteriorated any over the last 10 years to show this being the reason why they've lost people. It's pretty clearly that bad tax policy and other government programs have really devastated those states. I'm going to skip through a couple of these talking about the migration a little bit, but the basic concept is, though, that people are voting very strongly with their feet, and they're voting very strongly to the states with the lowest tax burdens and with no income taxes, especially. In our research in rich states, poor states, we find one of the key findings is that the states without personal income taxes and without corporate income taxes are vastly outperforming the states with the highest marginal rates. Now, this is a decade's worth of data that we analyze. We compare the 9 states without income taxes to the 9 states with the highest marginal rates. We look at gross state product growth, which is a big difference there. We look at population growth, 6.5% to almost 14% in the non-income tax states. We look at job growth. We're talking about less than 0.5% in the highest income tax states to nearly 8% in no income tax states. And then here's the one that is counterintuitive, that really presents a challenge to the liberal thinking on tax policy is, people would say, you need high income taxes to raise revenue. You look at this, 2-to-1 revenue growth in the states without income taxes. Even if you isolate out Alaska, who has had some of the best revenue growth in the last decade because of oil revenue, the no income tax states still outperform. And why is this? They have realized the key to good tax policy at the state level is you do not raise more revenue through raising rates, you raise more revenue through increasing your tax base, bringing more taxpayers into your state. Now, Texas has gained 4 congressional seats over the last decade alone. It's incredible the type of population growth they've seen. So these people are not paying state income taxes, but they're paying state sales taxes and property taxes and all the other mechanisms they have to fund state government. And I think I wanted to skip through quickly here just to briefly discuss how Missouri does in our ranking system. Now, our economic ranking of the 50 states are based on 15 equally weighted factors that Arthur Laffer has developed over the years to show relative competitiveness based on tax, regulatory, and labor policy. Missouri ranks fairly well. You've made some improvements in our 4 editions of this book. Now you're at number 9, with 1 being best, because of some of the good factors that you've had go on here. You certainly still have room for improvement. Considering, I think the important thing, though, is that things are not static across the 50 states today. As I mentioned, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, many other states are looking to cut taxes. Governor Mary Fallin in Oklahoma has pledged a $1 billion tax relief package for the state of Oklahoma as they continue their phase down of their income tax. We were with Governor Brownback's people yesterday in Topeka. They're also working on a plan to eliminate their reliance on income taxes. And we're very optimistic to see this region really take the laboratories of democracy model to tax policy, and we're very optimistic that we're going to see some really good gains here. And I think the other states across the country are going to be looking at Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma as, you know, if you can get it done, they're going to be following your lead, and if you're going to be able to show success, they're certainly going to follow your lead for job creation. So with that, I'll close my formal remarks and look forward to your questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks for coming this morning. So this is winter in Missouri. This is our first taste, apparently, so thanks for coming out this morning. So what I'm going to do is concentrate on Missouri and try to leave with maybe not so many answers as questions. And I'll propose some approaches to the answers to those questions, but maybe not give hard answers to this. What is indisputable? I'm going to start off with 3 slides. When I came to the University of Missouri in 2000, the gentleman, Ed Robb, who recently passed away, always told me that you could count on Missouri to be 2% of the nation in everything. He'd been using that rule of thumb for 25, 30 years, and that was his basis. So is that still true? And what I'm going to show you in the next few minutes is, depending on sort of the main measures that we use to judge how an economy is doing, it's not true anymore. I've got 15 years worth of consistent data. In other words, I can only go back to 1997 because the way the federal government started collecting gross state product data, they changed from the former standard industrial classification system to the North American industrial classification system, and we've got 15 years worth of data, but the picture is incontrovertible and consistent. So what I started off with is, let's look at relative production, right? Gross domestic product measured at the state level. So the goods and services that are produced within the boundary of the state of Missouri relative to the nation. I indexed that to 100 in 1997. The critical thing is, what's the slope of the line? It's been falling from 100 to somewhere, it's a little over 85. The index reading is 85 in 2010, which is the last value that we had. If we could get 2011, I don't think it would show a major pop-up. Let's just leave it at that. So if we were to look at, that's the measure of the goods and services that are produced. Well-being, kind of a measure of where we stand or where our standard of living is to take GDP and divide it by the number of people that live in the state. So this is now controlled for kind of what is the average level of income per person. That's what I mean by well-being. Again, the same picture, a few more wiggles, but basically it goes from 100 down to 80, a little 88, 89. And last, let's look at employment. This one actually raises kind of an interesting question. So employment, same downward slope. Relative to the U.S., Missouri employment has been falling. It's only fallen down to about 95 in terms of the index reading, which raise it. Now, if you were to do some simple math, what it's saying is that the employees in Missouri, their productivity has also been falling relative to the nation. We haven't lost as many workers. We've lost a lot more of the output that they've been generating. And so simple math tells us that the output per worker, or their productivity, has been falling relative to the nation as well. So we haven't lost as many workers as we did GDP, but the ones we retained weren't as productive. So that's the incontrovertible part. That's the data. Missouri is falling behind the nation. So the natural question is to ask why. So let's just propose a few starting points. The first thing that I think is important about this is not that I have the answer. I'm not going to approach it that way, but I think it's important to start with what are the questions and what's the methodology that we're going to do with this. let's start with the premise that the people who live in Missouri, just like everybody else, are undertaking actions that are in their own best interest. That's the starting point for this. Now, behaving in that way, things are going to matter to them, things like rules. And what's under the purview of the state policymakers are the kinds of rules like what are the tax rates that Jonathan gave us a kind of an excellent overview on. What are the regulations? How easy is it to get to work? The right to work proposal. What these things do is ultimately they're going to affect the cost. They're going to affect the cost of matching employers with employees, and they're also going to affect the returns to entrepreneurial activities. Jonathan didn't go into it in a great deal of detail, but let's just start off with the ideas. Economic growth, the things that the engines of economic growth are literally tied to the ideas and where those ideas are going to be fostered and promoted. So people have millions of ideas a day, or the average person has 3,000, I think is what the psychologists tell us. Not all of those are profitable. Not all of those are going to be cost-saving means of cost savings, but you want a lab, as to borrow Jonathan's words, you want a laboratory in which people can take those ideas and they can look at, they can try to earn rents or try to earn the returns on those, which are in their best interest. The other thing, sort of the spending side, is we've got these infrastructure issues. Maybe we've lost our way a little bit, and I'll point to that in just a second. One of the things that state government probably does reasonably well or thinks about is the infrastructure, highways, water mains, the entire set of things that get us from point A to point B and make our lives more enjoyable. That's an issue that's going to matter to economic growth too. Just to leave you with a thought, one of the great experiments that seemed to work at the federal government level was the interstate highway system. And estimates of the return to the U.S. interstate highway system have been as high as 45%. That's per annum, a 45% rate of return. Now, if they could find those kinds of projects and put funds towards those, I think we'd be a lot happier and maybe a lot better off. The other thing that I want to add today that I don't think we think about very much is just the role that uncertainty plays. It's been my sense, this has been, from a scientist standpoint, the last 4 years have been one of the great laboratories, or one of the great set of observations that we've ever had. Recessions, or the Great Recession, if you want to call it, if that's the label that's been going on, it just provides a lot of variation and a lot of interesting things to study. It's not so fun living through it, but it's a great thing to study. And one of the things that struck me about this one that looks a lot like the Great Depression in the 1930s is just the level of uncertainty. Now, I'll expand on that in the following way. Policymakers have been extraordinarily active in this environment. And every dollar that they spend is a future tax liability, a current or a future tax liability. There's no way of getting around that. So the point that we've got is this uncertainty fosters a kind of uncertainty about what the future is going to look like. When are the taxes going to go up? What kinds of taxes are going to go up? What kinds of spending programs are going to be involved? And all of these things create greater volatility around our future returns. And so if I'm looking at a state, I'm looking for something that's going to be fairly stable, at least in good policy, in terms so that I can take my ideas and try to get a reasonable. There's always going to be uncertainty about the future that we can't get rid of. But is the state adding? Is the state policymaker adding to that level of uncertainty? I don't mean to pick on one in particular, but this is just such an elegant illustration. And I want to thank Michael Rathbone for providing these slides for me. So tax credits. One of the things that has been the most active areas in the state of Missouri is just how tax credits, and these are only the last 5 years. You'll note in fiscal year 2009, it started in the middle of 2008, so July 2008 to the end of June 2009, we actually saw authorized tax credits in the state of Missouri go up from about 500 million to a little over 700 million. So that's what's been authorized. The other thing that I think is, it's been fluctuating since then, kind of coming down based on the fact that the people in Jefferson City seem to recognize that every dollar of tax credits they give means a dollar less that they can spend a day. But the other source of uncertainty that I think goes along with this is just looking at the last 2 years. So the blue part of this bar is authorized but not issued. So this is when the state has said, okay, we're going to authorize a certain amount of tax credits. They haven't been issued yet. The yellow part, or the gold part, has been issued but haven't been redeemed yet. Now the point that I want to make here is this $600 million that's in the gold part is just essentially a potential source of funding loss to the state of Missouri. Not that we want to necessarily give them that much more funding, that's not what I'm promoting, but what it does do is it adds a level of uncertainty about what the future tax liabilities are going to be for the citizens of Missouri, because I'll tell you right now, the theme in Jeff City seems to be we got to get our hands on some level of dollars. We need more dollars to do our job better. And so that liability represents a concern to them, because if it goes out, they've got to somehow find a way to replace that. And we know who's going to be paying when they replace that. So let me give you kind of a quick overview of what I think. The indisputable fact is Missouri's fallen behind, and we need to understand why. The other question is, or the aspect of this that we know about is that the rules and the expected rules. What is future policy going to look like? Both of those things matter to how Missourians are going to react, and whether they're going to vote with their feet and leave the state, or how they're going to react in terms of implementing good ideas that they have to that are going to provide new products and other new avenues for us to express our unlimited wants. And the last thing, this approach that I want to leave us with, while I'm not going to claim that I know all the answers now, I wouldn't have time to be here if I knew all the answers now. I'd be in my island somewhere enjoying myself, reaping the rewards of my indexed funds. But the nice thing is that places like this foster the real work that's going on here. In other words, what I really enjoy about things like ALEC and the Show Me Institute, what I think is extremely valuable is that these are hard questions, and to get answers to hard questions, people have to do the hard work. They have to do the heavy lifting in order to analyze these things. If we want to have a debate on these policy things, the best debate that we're going to have is after the hard work is done, and after it's done seriously. I put wrong-headed in parentheses here. That's because it's a personal view, but there's a lot of the policy environment that we have to fight is there's low-hanging fruit out there for the politician. They want to spend it. They want to somehow prove that they're making your life better, and in doing so, they find the lowest possible hanging fruit and they go out and spend resources. We have to ask the question: is it a wise way to spend those resources? I'm going to leave that because I think it's a good way to lever good questions from the audience now.
I have a question for both Joe and Jonathan. Wondering how you explain the dichotomy between Missouri having a very favorable ranking, number 9 on the ALEC index of considerations, taxes and so forth, and yet, as Joe pointed out, this 10-year falling real economy. Why the dichotomy between those two things?
Well, I think that's a great question, and we get that with a few states where we see this. I think really part of the answer relies on what we're trying to measure there. Of course, the performance has been subpar. That's certainly something to be very concerned about. However, on the outlook side, that's a prospective ranking going forward where we think that some of the tools that Missouri does have in place do position itself in better shape, for instance, than your neighbors to the east. Mitch Daniels once compared neighboring Illinois as living next to the Simpsons. Of course, you do benefit from that just because everyone in life does usually serve a purpose, even if it's to show you what not to do and become very uncompetitive. You do benefit from that, obviously. You're certainly not in the category of Illinois and some of the states that are really hurting out there in terms of lost job creation and other signs of economic vitality. Now, let me add a caveat to that, though, is that we equally rank the 15 factors that we choose for our rankings, and if you've got the books in front of you, it's on page 74 is a Missouri State page. And there are certainly things you do well here, avoiding a death tax, for instance, and for instance having some decent tax and expenditure limits over the years, although some of those have been eroded. However, if you were to focus on the most important variables of this index. I think Missouri has a whole lot more room for improvement than the overall ranking would suggest of 9. If you look at, for instance, the top marginal personal income tax rate, which I think is, as I mentioned based on our statistics, one of the most important factors for growth at the state level. Unfortunately, Missouri is in the bottom half of states in that factor, ranking 32nd of the 50 states. Then the other very, very important variable that we have is right to work status. And of course, that's been an issue of debate here. It still remains to be in Jefferson City, I know. But as we talk to business owners across the states, many times, as they looked at all the competing locations that are available out there to them for their new investment, states do not even make it to the full analysis unless they're a right to work state. Many times it's a yes or no, check yes or no box for right to work or not right to work, and the states that are right to work make it to the other considerations in their economic development efforts. For instance, the state of Indiana, you all saw the news where they became the first state north of the Mason-Dixon, east of the Mississippi to ever be a right to work state. They of course faced that big battle. It was a huge political battle to get this thing done, but they knew it was necessary to create a more favorable environment for job creation. And according to the governor's office, they've had several companies just after this decision start to really reconsider moving operations to Indiana. So I think if you look at the most important variables out of that sub-index, it does tell you a little bit different story than the overall ranking.
Just echo what Jonathan said. They have 15 measures in there that they're equally weighting. I gave you 3 measures because I'd probably, if I were to construct my own, those would get the biggest weights. So I didn't do a comprehensive, and maybe that's something that we'll do is do a real comparison across the states on the 3 measures that I had. That wouldn't be too difficult to do, but that's what accounts for the difference.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Would it be a lot of work to get the slide showing our slide in Missouri and compare that to the good states and the bad states, just as an index? Because I'm curious to know, you say an index of 100, and now we're down to 95 in this, and we're down to 85 in that, whatever, but so how's a good state doing?
Right, so I will say, Tennessee, we could do that. It wouldn't be challenging.
Is it 120 or is it 105?
I can't tell you off the top of my head. I don't know what the answer would be. But it is true that by construction, if Missouri and some other states are falling below, there have to be some other states that are rising relative to the U.S.
Is that a lot of work? You've got the data. Could you possibly do that?
Sure. And I think that's a great,
Could you add a slide and just maybe do New Jersey, New York, and Illinois is the bad, and Tennessee, Texas, and Florida is the good?
Your email is going to go to Elizabeth, and then Elizabeth will tell me which states you and I can tailor this to anything. It's not hard to do. It wouldn't be hard to do at all.
That'd be really neat to
see
that. Okay.
So I encourage everyone, send your favorite state. In Dallas, we actually, when I was at the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas, we actually had something that we called the spaghetti chart. So this was like 40 different lines, and it looked like a mass of spaghetti, but it was trends of different areas within the Federal Reserve District, within the Dallas Fed District.
So Jonathan had part of the answer, but didn't have time to show that slide. You had a slide of the 11 states since 1962 who had no income tax and then subsequently imposed an income tax. And in 11 out of 11, their performance relative to the other states declined. So if there's no relation between taxes and growth, it's pretty hard to get 11 in a row.
Rex has added 2 states that I didn't know had eliminated the income tax. I thought it was 9, but okay, that's, is it 9?
11, no, 11.
The 11 states that they added.
Okay. And they all declined subsequent to that.
I thought you were, okay.
Relative.
But yeah, just give Elizabeth what.
Elizabeth, you got your business card?
I do.
Okay.
Now, of course, this is pretty funny. Some people think it's a freak of nature that by some happenstance that out of this a big group of states that we've analyzed over 50 years, that there's some other thing going on other than the fact that these 9 states do not have income taxes. It's pretty interesting. I was talking to a reporter over in Topeka yesterday. He was trying to make this argument to me. Well, how do you know that it's actually taxes? But this slide is tremendous in talking about the real causal relationships here, is examining them against their former selves. and then taking a look at growth. And my home state of Michigan was one of those states that enacted an income tax, and we have declined precipitously. One of the reasons why, I think, is the fact that state income taxes, I like to call the opiate of state government. Once you are addicted and hooked on that revenue, it is very difficult to get off. It is. And it creates this boom and bust cycle in state budgeting that during the good times, this is the California example, during the good times, California is awash in cash because of capital gains tax revenue and their steeply progressive reliance on progressive income taxes. But during the bad times, they are really in poor shape. And they're issuing IOUs every couple of years to state vendors because they don't have the cash flow. And that is because of their reliance on the progressive income tax. It has the effect of ratcheting up government over time at the state level. And I think that's why you see the relative performance go down in those 11 states that have enacted income taxes.
Should people read the Missouri Compromise on our website?
Sure. Yeah.
We have a publication which you can link to on our website called the Missouri Compromise that goes through some of this data. We're looking at, actually Dr. Laffer prepared that for us, so again, you might want to take a look at that publication.
Question for Mr. Haslag. Your slide was kind of a cautionary tale on tax credits. And Missouri just is looking at some legislation right now that's using tax credits, I think in a good way to help the education system here. But would you say, are there conditions in which tax credits can be used as a tool for the state?
Undoubtedly. You just have to be careful, and you want to make sure that you've done the work. So when I say rules matter, I could also sort of substitute and say prices matter, and tax credits are going to change the relative prices of things. And in certain instances, you can make that case. I'll give you an illustration. People can differ on this, but there's a good debate over the historic preservation tax credit. If you believe that there's an externality that goes along with the beautiful old buildings that exist, if there's a market failure of some sort like that, and by providing a tax credit, you're going to make sure that that supply of old housing and old buildings is kept up, then there's a reasonable case to be made. But at least we're debating about our values and about how these things are going to work and how valuable is that externality, instead of I think we've gotten into the trap of just saying state legislatures seem to have understood competition on the side that's most closely under their purview. And that is, they understand I have to compete against Illinois, and if I spend an extra dollar by providing that for Mamtech, for example, or pick your favorite failure, I don't know that there are any successes. The other thing that would be nice is if the state actually had an accounting system that was set up so that we could judge the rate of return on the various tax credits. If you ask them how they do that, and my own home university is just as bad. We instituted an incubator several years ago, and Mike Podgorski, who's on the board of directors, spoke about this, and I went out to lunch with a research person at the university system, and he said, "Oh, this is great. This is going to work. It's going to foster all these jobs, all these new startups." And all we asked was, that may be true. We'll admit that may be true. We don't believe it, but at least set up the accounting system so that we can figure out what the rate of return on the incubator is. And he looked at us like we were talking a foreign language. Why would anybody really care about that? It's so hard to do. We have accounting school on the campus, by the way, with some very gifted accounting students.
Well, and I'll just add, I don't think a lot of taxpayers know this. A few of our tax credit programs are basically offline. In other words, they're not part of the appropriation process. They're like an entitlement. And that's a little crazy to have a balanced budget requirement, and there are significant line items that are not a part of the appropriation process.
I would just say, I agree 100% with what the professor said on that, and I think analyzing this across the 50 states, some of this picking winners and losers through tax policy has become pervasive. And I think you really see two different models of competitiveness, states trying to be competitive. The one model, of course, is kind of the live free or die model of New Hampshire and Texas and the states without income taxes. Everyone plays by the same rules. You have low taxes and you incentivize everyone, hopefully to create jobs and grow their companies and businesses within your state. Then you have the other model, which is the government picking winners and losers model, where you keep marginal rates high on everybody, and then kind of as a way of helping to help your favorite industries or companies, government officials love to pick those winners and get to give the handouts back to those who are supporters of them a lot of times, and will give them special carve-outs. Now, this gets to the dilemma of the seen and the unseen, I think, because so many times government officials love to be doing the ribbon cutting ceremonies and issuing the press releases saying, we've just created 1,000 new jobs in my district because of what I've done, giving you a special little handout. But what's not seen, in my home state of Michigan, this was very evident, in that Governor Granholm was the best press release governor on job creation when she would go out to a plant and say, we just created 100 new jobs because of my clean energy credit or whatever that they're incentivizing people. The problem was, when you get the overall picture wrong and you become uncompetitive as a state, we were losing 1,000 jobs for every 100 jobs we were creating through these special programs. That's the dilemma, though, in the operation that politicians fall under. Their incentive structure is to be seen as job creators directly instead of allowing this general environment for job creation.
How does Missouri stack up as far as the unfunded public liability? That's why you had this. How do they rank as far as just how bad is the situation in Missouri?
Well, it's not good at all. I mean, you take a look at some of the data from the CAFRs, the financial reports of the state, or if you look at the more traditional analysis of these problems based on the Pew Foundation study that was done. Missouri, in our numbers that we had here at the time of publication, was looking at about a $9 billion unfunded liability. However, as I mentioned, whenever government says there's a problem, the reality is always worse. There's a couple of reasons why you can never really depend on official government accounting statistics when it comes to unfunded liabilities. There are some very flexible rules, let's put it, that governments can get away with on accounting side of things, that if you were a CEO and managing your own company's pension fund, you'd probably be in jail if you use those same rules. One of which is you don't actually have to realize the losses right away of the economic downturn. So in the fall of 2008, many state and local pension funds lost between 20 and 30% of their entire asset value. Now, they have this technique in government accounting called asset smoothing, where you can spread out those losses over 5 to 8 years, and you might not have to even start realizing them for a year after they've been made. So we're only starting to see part of the problem from 2008, unfortunately. And then the other big issue, of course, is the rate of return assumptions. Since so many of these plans still have the assumed rate of return at 8% or higher, if you were to take that down to, Warren Buffett says probably a 6% rate of return is what state and local government funds ought to be using. You do your math on that and you get your annually required contribution. And that's exactly why, that large number is exactly why state and local government officials don't want to lower the assumptions on their rate of return, is that it creates a huge cash flow problem for them in the current year. But if you look at those numbers, using kind of the more private sector valuation of the liabilities, I think the Missouri situation becomes much more acute. You go from $9 billion in unfunded liabilities to over $40 billion in unfunded liabilities. And that is the kind of the median range estimate. The estimate from Andrew Biggs over at American Enterprise Institute in Washington, who's a very skilled actuary, has you at $56 billion in unfunded liabilities. The other estimate that I mentioned was from two professors in Chicago that have studied this across the 50 states. So this is a very huge problem across the 50 states, and just you can see based on the magnitude of official government statistics versus probably what's more based in reality, there is a world of difference apart.
In terms of the variables that we discussed between competitive and non-competitive states, and I know, Jonathan, you didn't weight those variables, but you both given a lot of weight in discussion to two pretty obvious ones. One is the personal income tax rate. The other is right to work status, if I'm hearing you right. Are there another one or two key variables for those competitive states versus non-competitive that we really ought to be putting in the headlights and driving to become more competitive?
Well, let me just start and we can follow up. I think the other one that I would, both marginal income taxes on personal and the corporate side, and certainly right to work would be my top, but although I would maybe add one other there, and that is the institutional limits on the growth of state government. That's important to add that sense of predictability is one of the very important principles we talked about in tax policy. But if you do have institutional limits on the growth of state spending, you inherently build more predictability into your tax system. As I mentioned, the nexus between spending and taxes is impossible to get away from. And I think that's one thing that some of the very successful states have done. Now, some have done it institutionally to control spending, like Colorado through the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights and other states. Of course, you've had your experience with the Hancock Amendment, and we've had others. Now, in other places, though, I mean, California and the like, they have blown the lid on state spending, which of course has precipitated their rapid increase in tax burdens over time. Where, as I mentioned, though, the other way to do it, if you have enough political will and you elect the right people, some states do it without institutional controls and just say, no, our philosophy is we're going to live within our means and we're not going to spend more money that we have, and we're going to keep a reasonable limit on the growth of government that way. I tend to think, the old saying, if men were angels, there would be no need for government. I think if legislators were angels on spending, there'd be no need for institutional controls. But based on our experience of the 50 states, it's a whole lot easier and nicer to have a nice handy institutional control to maybe limit the growth of state spending, let's say, inflation and population or some sort of metric, to let government grow at a reasonable rate, but don't let it take over the private sector. And I think that would be one of the others that I would put a special emphasis on.
It is interesting. We've had the Hancock Amendment. I didn't live in this state when you guys were receiving checks or refund checks motivated by the Hancock Amendment.
We pay for it.
Yeah, well, so we're about $4.5 billion below the limit set by Hancock now, somewhere in that neighborhood. So the spending side, look, I would much prefer that we tackled the issue by picking this. I'm not saying government is too big or too small at this point. What I would prefer is that this is a point where everything should be on the table. We should really consider what it is that government's core functions are, and then fund those to the level that we think is appropriate. So it's not that I disagree with Jonathan, but I would prefer a more wholesale revisiting of the issue. And we haven't had a constitutional convention in the state since 1947. The old convention rules out a lot of things. It sets up a lot of rules for what kinds of things that we're going to fund that may not be appropriate for now. And now's as good a time as any to revisit what those issues are and figure out what our core missions are.
You both agree, though, that state spending rate of growth of government is that number 3 or that other core variable that we really ought to be looking at?
Quantitatively, I think the rules of what matters the most, in my view, are it is state income and corporate income tax rates, the things that affect capital. I would say that. I haven't seen real good evidence yet on the right to work. In my heart, I will tell you, I think it's probably quantitatively important, but I haven't done the research yet to verify that quantitatively it's important. My gut tells me it is, but it's a hard issue to disentangle because right to work and high income tax rates are pretty highly correlated across these 50 labs. So identifying which one is which is...
Thank you.
Did somebody here have a question? Yeah. Andrew.
I had a question about, you talked about the rate of return on the infrastructure of highways and things, and I guess how does the privatization of those core government functions, like offloading highway department things to private enterprise, which is a trend that you see in some places, the private prisons, the other things, I mean, how does that dynamic, which is continuing to grow quietly, play into this? Because as government offloads those functions, the revenue controls and ideally the private companies getting those contracts are securing those returns. So government's giving away the farm, isn't it?
Well, no, there's lots of ways to deal with this, right? One way is you could just give away the farm, but a lot of government assets end up being leased or sold. The thing that it introduces is, and it's not every one of them. There are lots of public utilities or things like that are run, let's call it efficiently. We don't know that for sure, but let's start with that premise even. The point is that privatizing wouldn't make that any worse, right? On average, the right incentive structure would then be imbued into the management of those assets. The government would be able to sell it. It would free up resources because now instead of tying up those resources and running a public utility or or something, a road system would be freed up and the maintenance issues would be involved. So I worded it as carefully as I could. I don't think it would do any worse. Actually, my gut tells me it would be a lot better. But those are worthy experiments. That's part of saying everything should be on the table. We should consider what are our core functions, and then what's it worth to keep and what's it worth to not keep, and go accordingly.
Jonathan, I can't resist asking you what your reaction is to the Clint Eastwood halftime in America ad in the Super Bowl. You know, the people who like that ad, of course, are claiming that the government came in and saved 1 million jobs. So it's being used as an argument that government does do job creation well. So what is your reaction?
Well, you know, sometimes actors are a little bit politically naive. You know, this is a guy that's ostensibly a libertarian and is being used, probably going to be featured in a lot of ads this fall to support bigger government policies. A lot of the law and unintended consequences, I think, is pretty much at play there. One of the things I think about the whole issue is that, you know, certainly for every success story, and there may be some success stories when government occasionally gets it right, blind squirrel finds an acorn every now and then. But I mean, when it comes to that, there's a whole lot of stories of failure to go along with it, and I wouldn't necessarily cede the first point anyways. I haven't studied that issue in depth myself, but let me tell you one thing that was really messy when the government got involved in this auto bailout business a couple of years back, is that based on my conversations with some of the pension fund holders in Indiana, who actually tried to bring suit to stop the fire sale of Chrysler and to the Italians, it basically came and told the story. Richard Murdoch, who's the state treasurer of Indiana, tells the story very, very well. This was a deeply personal issue for him, is that Chrysler could have spun off a couple of its profitable divisions and probably been just fine and retained its status here. But more or less, based on the conversations from the Treasurer's offices, he felt that they were pushed by our administration into the fire sale to Fiat. And now, of course, you know, we have the consequences roll around that. The other issue there was how messy it was for pension fund holders, is secured creditors who are supposed to have, of course, the first dibs on this type of a transaction. Did not. They had a very, very low rate of return on their investment, while unsecured creditors, who happened to be the unions in Indiana, got first dibs at the Chrysler sell-off. So it was a very difficult situation for them, but in the process, it really created a big problem for the Indiana State Troopers pension fund, for instance, who took a huge hit because they were very heavily invested in what was a native industry there. So now I just say that to highlight the fact that, you know, sometimes government you know, gets it right occasionally, but, you know, a lot of cases like this, it gets very, very messy. So, you know, I think, you know, we're going to see a lot of the ad going forward.
I know you directed this to him, but can I jump in real quick?
Oh, sure, please.
Maybe it was a squirrel finding a blind squirrel finding a nut, but the real question is, what would have happened if we'd spent those resources in another way? That's the comparison, and that's the hard work that has to be done. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
We have time for one more question.
So it seems like a lot of the focus has been on primarily income taxes. And it seemed to me that maybe the more explanatory variable would be like the average effective tax rate across all taxes. Because it seems there's two significant taxes being left out here, being property, obviously, and gross receipts and so forth. My question is, have you examined, I guess, the effect of these taxes on, I guess, business relocation and actually interstate migration, and the actual cumulative effect of taxation? Because certainly some states have very high statutory effective or statutory rates, but others might actually have lower burden, if you will, despite that.
So, first of all, I'm an economist, so everything to me that matters is on the margin. So the marginal tax rate is important. The average tax rate has already included all of the behaviors that are distorted by the high marginal tax rates. So I don't know that the average tax burden is very helpful in being able to explain things because it's polluted or diluted from the measure that you're trying to get. Again, the last thing I'll say is all of those things should be on the table and they should be discussed. So I wouldn't want to. I think you've got a good point.
Yeah, I mean, obviously all taxes will matter in some degree over the other, and isolating out which ones matter more is the most important question, because there obviously is going to be some need to fund state government core functions. We're not anarchists, and we do believe in some limited form of state government. There are certain things that state government does awfully well, much better than the federal government, but if you look at some of the research out there, the OECD, certainly not a conservative think tank, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, they in 2008 did a analysis based on their experiences and ranked the variable, the different tax revenue streams and their variable impact on growth. And they come out that corporate income tax is most damaging, individual income tax is second most, and then you get into the consumption tax category. And that basically squares with our analysis as well at the 50 state level. So certainly all taxes matter. We just, I think the marginal effects, of course, of marginal income tax rates are the ones to really worry about, though.
We want to thank you all for coming. Thank our speakers.